In 1994, the genocide against Rwanda's Tutsi population made international headlines. The facts seemed straightforward. The country's Hutu militias had macheted to death hundreds of thousands of Rwandan Tutsis in a brutal act of ethnic cleansing. The violence ended when the Tutsi-led rebel army, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, took control under the leadership of Paul Kagame, who's now the country's president. A counter-narrative put forward by some human rights advocates suggested the violence had not been one-sided, that Kagame's RPF was also guilty of mass killings, but that story has been routinely dismissed as propaganda. Now, a new book written by a veteran reporter and featuring hundreds of eyewitness accounts and leaked documents argues that there was a second parallel genocide. In Praise of Blood, The Crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front is written by Judy Raver, who's been reporting from Central Africa for over 20 years. The book paints a much more complicated picture of the events of 1994, and it offers a disturbing portrait of Rwandan President Paul Kagame, a man venerated by leaders in the US and the UK. Judy Raver joins me now from Montreal. Judy, hello, welcome to the program.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Now, long before the 1994 genocide, there had been tensions between Rwanda's two ethnic groups, the Tutsis and the Hutus. What was the source of those tensions?
Well, the history of Rwanda is complex. Land and cattle and power were consolidated among a Tutsi monarchy. Tutsi elites and Hutus, the ethnic Hutus, were indentured in that system, although there were a good number of poor Tutsis as well. And then we had colonial rulers, Germany and Belgium, reinforcing rigid social categories. So what we saw in the 50s is a Hutu revolt, 1950s, against these injustices, and that transformed into a revolution in 1959 that led to a transition toward independence. And so we saw after that, in the late 50s, early 60s, a wave of Tutsis leaving Rwanda, hundreds of thousands of them fleeing pogroms, attacks against their people, and they settled in neighboring countries. A significant portion of them were settled in Uganda, and many of the men, Tutsi men, joined the Ugandan rebel movement and waged bush wars in the 70s and 1980s. So that's what we saw, and then a group of people then invaded Rwanda in 1990 and started a rebellion to gain territory and overthrow essentially the Rwandan government. And it culminated, I think, sort of what we saw as an invasion war and scorched earth campaign waged by, you mentioned Kagame's rebel forces, the Rwandan Patriotic Army, and its political movement, the Rwandan Patriotic Front. Some of their operations laid the context for the genocide happening in 1994.
So what was the RPF's aim? What was their main goal?
Their main goal was to reclaim status and power that they felt they were entitled to. They were not going to be able to do it through elections. Paul Kagame realized that, he wasn't interested in the Arusha peace accords. These were a series of negotiations and accords that had been laid out in order to share power, have a hold on the military, and have a place in government. That wasn't going to work. So what they wanted was power. And what we saw in the run-up to the genocide was infiltration of the country, the capital, setting the stage for violence, and all the evidence, most of the evidence actually that we've seen in later years shows that Kagame's commandos were responsible for assassinating the Hutu president in 1994, and that act triggered the genocide.
So just tell us a little bit more about him before he ends up being in charge of the country. What were his driving ambitions? Was it purely for power? Is it very much self-interested, or was it for, the good of the country? And where did he get his backing and his funding for this movement?
Well, I had mentioned Uganda and their alignment, the Rwandans being raised. We have a faction of Rwandan Tutsis being raised in Uganda, joining Uganda's rebel leader at the time in the 70s and 80s, Yoweri Museveni's national resistance movement. Already in the 1970s and 80s, Yoweri Museveni was getting backing, military and financial backing from the United States. So what we have is a coalition, a group of people that the United States felt it could do business with, it could assist and help in their geopolitical interests on the continent. And so clearly we have that alignment, military and political, and also Kagame and his Rwandan colleagues received training in the United States. So that was happening in 1990 when Kagame and his colleagues invaded Rwanda, launched their rebellion. And they had that political cover and political backing throughout the invasion war, throughout their operations through the genocide as well, and thereafter. So it's the United States. Washington has been a powerful backer and continues to be, actually.
And so that original invasion, did it receive a lot of attention at the time?
No, it did not. I mean, clearly people were aware of it, and but there was no international condemnation that Uganda, with its military, had enabled these Rwandans to cross over and launch a rebellion to overthrow the state, and especially seize territory. I mean, the negotiations had been going on, and at the time, Juvenal Habyarimana, the president, had announced that he would accept the return of Tutsi refugees and bring them into the fold. There were moves to open up the country to multi-party democracy, but to be honest, I don't think the RPF really believed that any of that would happen. They didn't believe that. They felt that this was a dictatorship, an authoritarian regime that would be resistant to democracy. And at the same time, there was this faction of the RPF that had were controlling its direction, Kagame and his colleagues, who had more extremist tendencies, actually, that wanted power at all costs. So I think their political objectives, which looked good on paper, which favored multi-party democracy, were actually aimed at achieving power.
And so I guess the real boiling point, the tipping point came when the plane carrying the then president that you just mentioned, Juvenal Habyarimana, was shot down. Was the RPF implicated in that?
Well, the most compelling evidence shows that they were responsible for that. And so the situation was, because of the peace negotiations as part of that, the Arusha Accord, the RPF had and because of the amount of land that it had already seized in northern Rwanda. It had a place in the capital. It was a number of soldiers, about 600 of a battalion, 600 members were already in the capital. It had infiltrated the capital, and clandestinely it had set up a team to bring in missiles. All of this is very well documented and has been proven that there were missiles that had been purchased from the former Soviet Union by Uganda. RPF, ex-RPF members have testified that those missiles were brought into the capital, and those missiles were used to attack, shoot down the plane carrying Habyarimana on April 6, 1994. Now, the two pieces of evidence that are the most compelling to show that are a summary document that reveals testimony from RPF informants to the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda that was set up by the UN, a tribunal to investigate crimes during 1994. And the UN investigators did privately investigate crimes. And so they interviewed a number of RPF informants who gave them this testimony. That was 2003. And I have a document that details some of the testimony. It's called a summary document. Also, in 2006, we saw the release by a French judge called Jean-Louis Bruguière that concluded that Kagame's commando team shot down the plane. And he recommended, or he issued, a series of arrest warrants against a number of senior commanders that evidence pointed to who were responsible for the attack. So those two pieces, I would say, conclusive pieces of evidence corroborate each other. They're very compelling. And so the final word hasn't, the French have not finished their inquiry, and so it hasn't gone to the level of prosecution to issue indictments. But the problem with the issue of the plane is that the United Nations would not establish an inquiry, would not establish a tribunal to investigate this. And so I think that the French have been the only body, the only government interested in getting the answers as to who triggered the genocide. And that's really because parties have requested that France investigate it. There were French crew members aboard the plane that crashed, French crew members who were killed in 1994.
And so while the Tutsis are being macheted, hundreds of thousands of them, at the same time, you write, the RPF were slaughtering Hutus. How much of that would have been in self-defense, do you think?
There was some retaliatory violence by the RPF, but what really was happening is the violence was concurrent. A lot of the violence that the RPF waged on Hutus was preemptive and highly organized. So to answer your question, very little of it was in self-defense. So we have a dynamic. We have two things happening. The RPF had already seized a fair amount of territory in the north, if you can picture it. When they appeared to have shot down the plane, they had all their troops in place militarily to move very rapidly to seize territory and rout Hutu forces. So they did this fairly quickly, moving from the north down the eastern flank to the south of the country and then back up to the northwest before taking the capital in July. And so behind the battlefront, so very quickly, their troops were pushing the Hutu military out of those zones. Behind that battlefront, it very quickly, from April 6th, 7th, 8th onward, very quickly, they attacked Hutu villagers. They attacked Hutu intellectuals first, rounded them up to try to destroy their the whole community, and then moved very quickly, attacking with traditional instruments like hoes or shooting Hutu peasants. And when in areas where it was harder to do that, they loaded Hutus on buses, brought them to private areas in parks, etc., and shot and burned their bodies there. So this was an elaborate scheme. It was hard to see because I think the journalists covering the Rwandan genocide were not in those zones. There was a lot of propaganda, a propaganda war being waged at the same time. And so you had, as you mentioned, you had the dynamic of Tutsis being slaughtered in Hutu-held zones initially, and so that seized world attention very quickly. But at the same time, covertly and in ways that were hidden, the RPF was also killing Hutus.
Now, I haven't got very long left, but I do want to know what you think the effect this has in silencing, the silence of the crimes of the RPF and the impact it has on the local Hutu population.
Well, what we have is Kagame has, a lot of these crimes have bubbled up over the years in public records, UN reports, international indictments, but it's never been enough to counter this enormous false narrative that emerged after the genocide, that Kagame saved Rwanda and the international community abandoned Rwandans to their deaths. But what we have is, so Kagame operates with his apparatchiks in military intelligence like a mafia, an international mafia. They've killed many people who have openly challenged their narrative. They've blackmailed and corrupted and jailed and silenced others who reveal the level of barbarity, historical barbarity. And so it's very hard to puncture, to penetrate this. Now, at the same time, they've used the propaganda, but at the same time, the West has propped up and covered, powerful insiders have covered for those crimes. So there's a situation now, I think, with the West diplomats feeling that there could be another round of violence. And so they're trying to contain and also, prop up Kagame, but also probably very critical in private of the human rights abuses, which continue to be astonishing. So that's the situation that exists today. Rwanda is for all intents and purposes, a surveillance state. It operates outside its borders in Congo and in other areas around Rwanda with impunity, and it uses its embassies abroad to commit crimes and kill people. There have been a number of people killed, dissidents in South Africa. It's alarming.
Judy, it really is a fascinating book. We appreciate you sharing some time with us this evening. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Judy Raver is an independent journalist who has covered Central Africa for over 20 years. She's the author of In Praise of Blood, The Crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, published by Random House Canada. Next, 1 year on from the Uluru Statement. Where are we?